The strawberry tasted like summer itself, sweet, sun-warmed, perfect. Then came the crack of Lady Brooke's palm across Harriet's face, and the world went silent. The aristocratic gathering froze, teacups suspended mid-air, conversations dying on painted lips. But it was the Duke of Bewcastle who moved first, his hand closing around Lady Brooke's wrist with the inexorable certainty of a trap springing shut. He leaned close, his voice a whisper so low only Brooke could hear it, yet somehow everyone felt its chill. "You have just signed your own exile, madam." Hello, lovely. If you're settling in for a tale of courage, justice, and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of resilience and romance. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it truly brightens my day. The ring felt heavy on Harriet's finger, the gold band warm from her constant turning of it. She traced the Gregory family crest with her thumb, a lion rampant, crowned and proud, and wondered if her father had known in those final fever-gripped days what would become of her. 6 months, she whispered to the empty drawing room. Has it truly been only 6 months? 6 months since Lord Thomas Gregory had been laid to rest. 6 months since Lady Brooke McCarthy, his widow of barely 2 years, had begun systematically dismantling everything he'd built. 6 months since Harriet had watched her inheritance, her autonomy, her very identity slip through her fingers like water through a sieve. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the room exactly as it had been when her father was alive, but everything felt different now, hollow. The mahogany furniture gleamed with the same polish, the Persian rugs lay in their familiar places, yet the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a beautiful prison, and Brooke held the only key. "Your father spoiled you terribly," Papa's voice echoed in her memory, warm with affection as he'd taught her about crop yields and tenant welfare, about honor and duty and treating people with dignity. "A young lady should know how to manage an estate, Harriet, not just embroider pillows for it. A young lady should know. What good was knowing when she had no power to act?" The door opened without a knock. It never did any more, that small courtesy stripped away like everything else. "There you are." Lady Brooke's voice was honey over steel, sweet and deadly. "Daydreaming again, I see. How very productive." Harriet rose from the window seat, her hands instinctively smoothing her gray morning dress. Pray, everything she wore now was gray or black or some pale shade of mourning that Brooke insisted upon, despite the fact that proper mourning for a parent ended after a year. Brooke said it showed proper respect. What it truly showed was control, one more way to make Harriet invisible. "The accounts are no longer your concern." Brooke swept into the room, resplendent in deep emerald silk that somehow managed to be both mourning and magnificent. At 41, her stepmother remained striking, every auburn curl arranged to perfection, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. "Your father's will was quite explicit." Explicit. The word tasted bitter. The will had made Brooke Harriet's guardian until she turned 25 or married with Brooke's approval. 3 more years. 3 years of watching her father's legacy be sold off piece by piece, of hearing whispers about nervous dispositions and fragile constitutions whenever she dared to object. "The estate manager mentioned that the Western Fields, the estate manager reports to me." Brooke examined her reflection in the gilt mirror above the fireplace, adjusting an already perfect earring. "Not to young ladies who read too many books and develop ideas above their station." Above her station, Harriet was Thomas Gregory's daughter, the rightful heir to everything her family had built over generations. But under English law, under her father's well-intentioned but catastrophic will, she was nothing, less than nothing, a ward, a child, a problem to be managed. "Now then," Brooke continued, her tone shifting to something almost pleasant, which was always more dangerous than her cruelty.
The Duke of Bewcastle has extended an invitation, a riverside picnic at his estate this Friday. All the best families will attend. Harriet's stomach clenched. Social events were Brooke's hunting ground, places where she could parade Harriet before potential suitors, men twice her age with gambling debts or younger sons seeking fortunes to squander, men who would take what little remained of her inheritance and leave her with even less autonomy than she possessed now. "I'm not feeling well," Harriet tried. "Perhaps you'll attend." The pleasant mask slipped, revealing the steel beneath. "And you'll be charming. Lord Ashworth's nephew will be there. A promising match." "I have no interest." "Your interests are irrelevant." Brooke moved closer, her perfume, heavy roses and something darker, filling Harriet's lungs like smoke. 3 more years, my dear stepdaughter. 3 more years of this tedious defiance, or you accept a suitable match now. The choice is yours. Well, perhaps not entirely yours. The threat hung unspoken between them. Harriet had heard the rumors, the whispered conversations Brooke had with Dr. Thornbury, the family physician who owed Brooke more favors than Harriet cared to count. Women who proved difficult could be declared unstable, hysterical, mad. They disappeared behind the doors of private asylums where family money ensured they'd never emerge to cause trouble again. "I'll attend the picnic," Harriet said finally, hating the defeat in her voice, hating that her father's ring felt like a shackle rather than a legacy. "Excellent." Brooke's smile was triumph personified. "Wear the pale blue silk, and do try to look less miserable. Melancholy is only attractive in poetry, dear. In reality, it's simply tiresome." As Brooke's footsteps faded down the hallway, Harriet returned to the window, watching the grounds her father had loved stretch green and golden towards the horizon. Somewhere out there was freedom. Somewhere beyond Brooke's reach was the woman she was supposed to become. But how did one escape invisible chains? How did one fight an enemy who wielded law and propriety as weapons, who smiled while tightening the noose? The ring caught the sunlight, and for just a moment Harriet let herself remember her father's final words, whispered through fever and failing breath. "Be strong, my darling girl, stronger than they think possible." She hadn't understood then. She thought he meant survive. But perhaps he meant something more. Perhaps he meant fight.
The breakfast room felt suffocating, despite the tall windows overlooking the rose garden. Harriet sat rigid in her chair, the pale blue morning dress she'd chosen, modest, appropriate, her mother's favorite color, now a source of conflict. "Absolutely not!" Brooke's fork clattered against her plate. "That shade makes you look consumptive, and the neckline is far too severe. Lord Ashworth's nephew will think you're a prude." Harriet's fingers tightened around her teacup. The porcelain was Wedgwood, part of her mother's trousseau, one of the few pieces Brooke hadn't yet sold. "The dress is perfectly appropriate." "I'll determine what's appropriate in my household." Brooke dabbed her lips with her napkin, the gesture somehow conveying absolute contempt. "You'll wear the cream silk, the one with the lower neckline. And for heaven's sake, do something about your posture. You slouch like a scullery maid." Harriet straightened automatically, hating herself for the compliance. This was how it always went, Brooke wielding cruelty like a conductor's baton, orchestrating misery with practiced precision. "Your toast," Brooke continued, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. "Must you butter it so vigorously? A lady takes delicate bites, small, refined, invisible." Harriet set down her knife, her appetite vanishing. "I received correspondence yesterday," Brooke said, producing a letter from her sleeve. "From Mr. Henderson, the estate agent. He's found an enthusiastic buyer for the northern acreage." Ice flooded Harriet's veins. "The northern acreage? But that's been Gregory land for 4 generations. The tenant families will be the new owner's concern." Brooke's smile was razor-sharp. "The sale will provide excellent capital for your dowry, assuming you prove marriageable."
Father would never have sold that land. Those families depend on us. The Thorntons have farmed that soil since before I was born. Your father is dead." The words landed like a physical blow. "And his sentimental attachments died with him. I'm guardian of this estate, and I'll manage it as I see fit." "Those people trust us. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I please." Brooke set down her napkin with deliberate precision. "Every decision, every signature, every sale, all perfectly within my rights as guardian. Or would you prefer I make other arrangements for your care?" There it was, the threat that always lurked beneath every conversation. Other arrangements. Dr. Thornberry's sympathetic visits, whispers about nervous conditions, private asylums where inconvenient daughters disappeared behind locked doors, declared mad by doctors whose loyalty could be purchased. "The northern acreage stays. It's not yours to sell." Brooke's expression hardened, beautiful and terrible as winter frost. She rose slowly, moving around the table with predatory grace. "Everything is mine to sell, my dear. Every acre, every tenant contract, every stick of furniture. Your father's will gave me complete authority." She paused behind Harriet's chair. 3 more years of your tedious defiance, or you accept a suitable match now. Those are your options." Harriet's hand found her father's ring beneath the table, turning it once, twice, seeking comfort. "I also received another letter," Brooke continued, returning to her seat, "from Mr. Blackwell, your father's former solicitor. He seems to have questions about certain estate transactions, tiresome questions about expenditures and revenue allocations." A flicker of hope sparked in Harriet's chest. Mr. Blackwell had been her father's solicitor for 20 years, a man of impeccable integrity. If he'd noticed discrepancies— "I've dismissed him, of course," Brooke said, watching Harriet's face with obvious amusement, "and retained Mr. Thaddeus Pike instead, a much more understanding gentleman. Mr. Blackwell's interference will cease immediately." The hope died as quickly as it had kindled. "You can't simply dismiss him. I can do precisely as I wish." Brooke's smile widened. "Now the Duke's picnic is Friday. You'll attend, you'll be charming, and you'll make Lord Ashworth's nephew feel like the most fascinating man in England. Or I'll begin the paperwork with Dr. Thornberry on Monday morning. He's already quite concerned about your melancholic disposition, your inappropriate interest in estate matters. Do I make myself clear?" Harriet said nothing. Brooke held every card, controlled every move. The law was on her side. Society was on her side. Even Harriet's own inheritance had been weaponized against her. "Excellent," Brooke said, interpreting silence as surrender. "I knew you'd see reason." But as her stepmother glided from the room, her hand found her father's ring beneath the table, turning it slowly. The northern acreage, Mr. Blackwell's dismissal, the steady dismantling of everything her father had built. "Be strong, my darling girl, stronger than they think possible." Perhaps Friday's picnic would bring more than another humiliation. Perhaps it would bring an opportunity, a chance, a single moment where the invisible chains might weaken. She just had to survive long enough to seize it.
The invitation arrived on Wednesday morning, delivered by a liveried footman bearing the Bewcastle crest, a silver wolf rampant on midnight blue. Harriet watched from the drawing-room window as Brooke received it in the entrance hall, her stepmother's practiced smile faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. That flicker of uncertainty sent a strange thrill through Harriet's chest. Brooke was never uncertain. "How peculiar," Brooke said, sweeping into the drawing-room with the heavy vellum in hand. Her voice carried that false lightness she used when something had genuinely unsettled her. "An invitation from the Duke of Bewcastle for Friday's riverside picnic."
"You mentioned it yesterday," Harriet said carefully, not looking up from her embroidery. "Lord Ashworth's nephew will be attending." "Yes, but this—" Brooke's fingers tightened on the paper. "This is addressed specifically to you, to Miss Harriet Gregory, with a personal note from His Grace himself." Now Harriet did look up. In all her 22 years she'd never received a personal note from Lucas Chapman, the Duke of Bewcastle. She knew of him, of course. Everyone did. He was legend and rumor combined. The Ice Duke, they called him, a man whose cold precision and unwavering sense of duty had made him both feared and respected throughout the county. He'd inherited the title at 19, and in the decades since had transformed Bewcastle from a respectable estate into something approaching an empire. But he'd also been her father's friend, not in the warm, convivial way of drinking companions, but in that peculiar manner of men who recognized honor in each other. They'd served together on various committees, had corresponded about agricultural reform and tenant welfare. Her father had spoken of the Duke with a respect he reserved for few. "What does it say?" Harriet asked, setting aside her embroidery. Brooke's jaw tightened. She read aloud, her voice clipped. "Miss Gregory, I trust this invitation finds you well. Your presence at the Friday's gathering would honor both the memory of your esteemed father and my own regard for the Gregory family. I hope the riverside setting will prove agreeable. Your servant, Bewcastle." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken things. Harriet's mind raced. Your presence would honor the memory of your esteemed father. Not Lord and Lady Brooke McCarthy and Miss Gregory, not addressed to the household, specifically to her with explicit reference to her father. "How thoughtful of His Grace," Harriet said carefully, watching Brooke's face. "Thoughtful?" Brooke's smile was brittle as sugar glass. "Yes, quite thoughtful indeed." She moved to the window, the invitation still clutched in her hand. "Though I confess I'm surprised. The Duke of Bewcastle is not known for his sentimentality. One wonders what prompted such specific attention." Harriet said nothing, but her heart had begun to beat faster. Brooke, who controlled every aspect of Harriet's life, was wondering about something beyond her control. "Of course you'll attend," Brooke continued, turning back with that calculating look Harriet knew too well. "It would be unconscionable to refuse the Duke's personal invitation, though I must say I find the timing rather curious." "Curious?" "Mr. Blackwell's interference, and now this." Brooke tapped the invitation against her palm. "The Duke served with your father on the Agricultural Reform Committee. They corresponded regularly. One might even say they were allied on certain matters of estate management." Understanding dawned cold and clear. Brooke thought Mr. Blackwell had contacted the Duke, that the solicitor's tiresome questions had somehow reached Bewcastle's ears before his dismissal, that this invitation was not mere courtesy, but reconnaissance. "I'm sure that His Grace is simply being kind," Harriet offered, keeping her voice neutral. "Father spoke highly of him. Perhaps he wishes to ensure I'm well situated after my loss." Perhaps, but Brooke didn't sound convinced. She studied Harriet with those ice-blue eyes that missed nothing. "You'll be charming at this picnic, Harriet. You'll laugh, you'll smile, you'll show every appearance of a happy, well-adjusted young lady under the loving guardianship of her devoted stepmother. You'll make it abundantly clear that your father's death, while tragic, has left you in the most capable hands." She paused, letting the threat settle between them like frost. "I understand," Harriet said quietly. "Good." Brooke's smile returned, warm as a serpent's. "I knew you would. After all, we wouldn't want to give the Duke the wrong impression. Men of his stature have no patience for hysterical females or family dramatics." After Brooke left, Harriet returned to the window, watching the Bewcastle footman mount his horse and depart down the long drive. The invitation lay on the side table where Brooke had left it, the heavy vellum cream-colored and official. "Your presence would honor the memory of your esteemed father." Her father had trusted Lucas Chapman, had respected him, perhaps even anticipated that Harriet might need an ally when he was gone. The will had been written in haste during his final illness, drafted by a solicitor Brooke had recommended when Mr. Blackwell was conveniently unavailable. Had her father known? Had he suspected what Brooke would become? Harriet picked up the invitation, tracing the bold signature at the bottom. Bewcastle. Not a flowery hand, but strong and sure. The signature of a man who meant what he wrote. Friday's picnic suddenly felt less like another performance and more like a lifeline. But Brooke was right about one thing. Powerful men could be dangerous. The question was whether the Duke of Bewcastle's danger would be directed at Brooke's cruelty or at Harriet's desperate hope. She folded the invitation carefully and slipped it into her pocket, next to her father's ring. 2 pieces of her past carried close to her heart. 2 reminders that she once was someone worthy of respect. Be strong, my darling girl, stronger than they think possible. Perhaps her father had left her one final gift after all. Perhaps Lucas Chaplin was that gift. She just had to be brave enough to accept it.
Friday arrived with the kind of summer brilliance that made cruelty seem impossible. The sky stretched endless and blue above the Bewcastle estate, and the River Avon sparkled like scattered diamonds as carriages deposited the county's finest families along the manicured grounds. White linen cloths covered tables arranged beneath ancient oaks, and servants moved with practiced efficiency, setting out silver tea services and tiered trays of delicate pastries. Harriet stepped from the carriage in her cream silk dress, the lower neckline exactly as Brooke had demanded. The fabric whispered against her skin, expensive and beautiful and utterly wrong. Her mother would have chosen something simpler, more modest. But her mother was 8 years in the grave, and Brooke's hand was firm on Harriet's elbow as they approached the gathering. "Remember what we discussed," Brooke murmured, her smile never wavering as she nodded to Lady Pemberton. "Charming, happy, devoted, the picture of filial contentment." "Yes, stepmother," Harriet said, the words tasting like ash. The Duke of Bewcastle stood near the largest table, conversing with Lord Ashworth. Even from a distance, Lucas Chapman was unmistakable. Tall and lean, dressed in impeccable dark blue that matched his crest, his posture military straight. His hair was dark, touched with early silver at the temples despite being barely past 30, and his face held that peculiar quality of aristocratic severity that could either intimidate or inspire, depending on which side of his judgment one stood. As if sensing their approach, he turned. His eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, swept across the crowd and landed on Harriet with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Lady Brooke," he said, his voice carrying that cultured coolness she'd heard described as the Bewcastle tone. "Miss Gregory, welcome." "Your Grace," Brooke executed a perfect curtsy. "How generous of you to include us in such lovely company. Harriet has been quite looking forward to it." "Has she?" The Duke's gaze hadn't left Harriet's face. "I'm pleased to hear it. Miss Gregory, you have your father's eyes. I trust you remember our last meeting. You were perhaps 14, accompanying Lord Thomas to the Agricultural Reform Committee." Harriet did remember, a blur of important men and complex discussions, her father's pride as he'd introduced her to the assembled lords. "I remember, Your Grace. Father spoke highly of those gatherings." As he should have. His insights were invaluable. Lucas's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "I was grieved to learn of his passing. Thomas Gregory was a man of exceptional character." "Indeed he was," Brooke interjected smoothly, her fingers tightening on Harriet's elbow like a vice. "We all miss him terribly, but life continues, doesn't it? Harriet has been adjusting beautifully under my guidance." "I'm certain she has." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or suspicion. "Miss Gregory, I wonder if you might do me the honor of a brief walk along the river after refreshments. There are matters regarding your father's work on the committee that I'd value your perspective on." Panic and hope collided in Harriet's chest. This was it, an opportunity, a moment alone with someone who might listen, who might help, who might— "How thoughtful, Your Grace,"
Brooke said, her voice like honey over steel, though I fear Harriet tires easily these days. The grief, you understand. She's been quite delicate. Perhaps a shorter conversation here among company would be more suitable. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, whatever is most comfortable for Miss Gregory. I would be honored to walk with you, Your Grace, Harriet said quickly, the words tumbling out before Brooke could stop them. Darling, you know what Dr. Thornbury said about overtaxing yourself, the spells you've been having. Spells? Lucas's attention sharpened. Nothing serious, Brooke assured him, merely the occasional bout of melancholy, sometimes confusion. The physician believes it's grief manifesting in unfortunate ways. We're monitoring the situation carefully. Harriet's blood ran cold. This was it, the foundation Brooke had been building, brick by careful brick, public witnesses to Harriet's supposed instability. The Duke of Bewcastle himself, hearing about confusion and melancholy and medical supervision. I assure you, Your Grace, I'm perfectly well, Harriet said, keeping her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss Father's work. Would you? Brooke's voice dropped to a whisper only Harriet could hear as Lord Ashworth approached to greet the Duke. And what exactly would you discuss, my dear? How unhappy you are? How cruel I've been? His Grace would find such complaints terribly ungracious, ungrateful, perhaps even unhinged. She released Harriet's arm and stepped forward, her public smile radiant. Your Grace, Lord Ashworth, what a magnificent setting you've created. Harriet, darling, why don't you refresh yourself with some lemonade? You look rather flushed, the heat unsure. Dismissed like a child. Harriet moved toward the refreshment table, her mind racing. Every word, every gesture had to be perfect. One slip, one moment of visible distress, and Brooke would use it as evidence of instability. But how could she signal for help when silence was being weaponized against her? Miss Gregory. She turned to find the Duke beside her, his presence commanding even in the casual setting. Up close, his eyes were more complex than she'd realized, grey layered with flecks of blue, intelligent and assessing. Your Grace, your stepmother seems quite concerned about your health. Are you truly unwell? This was the moment, the question she'd been waiting for. But Brooke was watching from 10 feet away, her expression pleasant and her attention absolute. I'm well, Your Grace, Harriet said carefully, simply adjusting to my father's absence. Adjusting, he studied her face. And the estate, is it adjusting well also? Help me, she wanted to scream. She's selling everything. She's planning to lock me away. Please, please help me. Instead, she said, the estate is in capable hands, Your Grace. But her fingers found her father's ring under her glove, turning it once, twice, 3 times, a nervous gesture she couldn't quite control. Lucas's gaze dropped to her hand, then back to her face, and in his eyes she saw understanding dawn. He knew. Somehow the Ice Duke knew.
The strawberry tasted like courage, sweet, sun-warmed, perfect. Harriet held it between her fingers, the red fruit blight against her pale glove, and made her decision. Your Grace, she said quietly, aware of Brooke's attention like a physical weight across her shoulders, if you truly wish to honor my father's memory, you might inquire about the northern acreage. He would have wanted to know it remains with the tenant families who've worked it for generations. The words hung in the air between them, small and dangerous as a lit fuse. Lucas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening, a sharpening of focus. The northern acreage, I was under the impression that land was fundamental to the Gregory estate's stability. It was, Harriet said. Father believed. Harriet, darling. Brooke's voice cut across the distance like a blade through silk. She glided toward them, her smile bright and terrible. You're boring His Grace with tedious estate matters. Gentlemen don't wish to discuss business at social gatherings. On the contrary, said Lucas coolly, I find estate management endlessly fascinating. Miss Gregory was about to explain her father's philosophy regarding tenant welfare. Was she?
Brooke's hand found Harriet's elbow again, fingers digging in. How sweet, though I fear Harriet has become rather confused about such matters lately. The grief, you understand. She sometimes forgets that decisions must be practical rather than sentimental. I'm not confused, Harriet said, something snapping inside her chest, like an over-tightened string. 22 years of compliance, 6 months of systematic cruelty, and suddenly she couldn't bear another moment of it. The northern acreage is being sold against my father's explicit wishes, against the welfare of families who've served us faithfully for decades. The gathering seemed to pause, conversations faltering as nearby guests registered the tension in Harriet's voice. "Darling," Brooke said, her smile frozen in place, "you're overwrought. Perhaps we should—" "I'm not overwrought." I pulled her arm free, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm trying to tell the truth. Father trusted those families. He would never have—" The slap came so fast Harriet barely saw it. One moment she was standing, speaking, finally finding her voice. The next, her head snapped to the side, the sharp crack of Brooke's palm against her cheek echoing across the suddenly silent garden. The strawberry fell from her fingers, tumbling into the grass. Red juice stained her glove like blood. For a heartbeat, the world stood absolutely still. Teacups frozen mid-pour, conversations dead on painted lips. Even the river seemed to hold its breath. Then Lucas moved. His hand closed around Brooke's wrist before she could draw back, his grip unyielding as iron. The movement was economical, precise, utterly without mercy. He pulled Brooke's arm down and away from Harriet, his other hand coming up to steady Harriet's shoulder, placing himself physically between them. "Madam," he said, his voice so quiet it was barely audible, yet somehow it carried across the entire gathering with the weight of absolute authority. "You have just made a grave error in judgment." Brooke's face had gone white, then red, her composure cracking like porcelain under pressure. "Your Grace, she was hysterical. You saw how she—" "I saw a young woman speaking truth." His fingers remained locked around Brooke's wrist, not bruising, but absolutely immovable. "And I saw you strike her in front of witnesses for the crime of honoring her father's memory." He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower, meant for Brooke alone, but carrying to those nearest with crystalline clarity. "You have just signed your own exile, madam. From this moment, Miss Gregory is under my protection. You will not touch her. You will not threaten her. You will not speak to her except through solicitors. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" "You have no right," Brooke began, her voice shaking with rage or fear or both. "I have every right." He released her wrist with deliberate disdain. "Thomas Gregory was my ally and friend. His daughter deserves better than a guardian who raises her hand in violence when confronted with uncomfortable facts." He turned to the gathering, his voice rising to address them all. "Lady Pemberton, might I impose upon you to escort Miss Gregory to the house? I believe she requires a moment to compose herself." Lady Pemberton, a formidable woman in her 60s who'd been watching the scene with narrowed eyes, stepped forward immediately. "Of course, Your Grace. Come, my dear, let's see to that cheek." But before Harriet could move, Lucas caught her hand, the one still stained with strawberry juice, and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "You were brave to speak. The next steps will require even greater courage. Are you prepared for that?" Harriet looked into those storm-gray eyes and saw what she'd been desperately hoping for, an ally, a protector, someone with the power to stand against Brooke's carefully constructed prison. "Yes, Your Grace," she whispered. "I'm prepared." "Good." He released her hand and stepped back, his attention returning to Brooke with glacial disdain. "We will speak further, Lady Brooke, very soon, and I suggest you retain excellent legal counsel." As Lady Pemberton led Harriet away, her cheek still burning from Brooke's blow, Harriet glanced back once. Lucas stood like a sentinel in the summer sunshine, his posture radiating cold fury, while Brooke looked smaller somehow, diminished, her carefully maintained facade crumbling under the weight of her own violence. The invisible chains hadn't broken yet, but for the first time in 6 months Harriet felt them begin to loosen. The Duke of Castle had declared war, and wars, her father had once told her, were won not by the strongest, but by those fighting for the right cause.
The guest room at Castle Manor was larger than Harriet's entire bedroom at home, decorated in shades of cream and gold that caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Lady Pemberton had seen her settled, applied a cool compress to her still burning cheek, and departed with a promise that the Duke would call upon her shortly. Harriet sat in a wing-back chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, trying to process what had just happened. Brooke had struck her, in public, in front of the most influential families in the county, and the Duke of Castle had stopped it, with a grip like iron and words that had felt like a sentencing. "You have just signed your own exile, madam." A knock at the door made her straighten. "Enter." But it wasn't Lucas who swept into the room. It was a woman Harriet had never seen before, tall and regal, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair swept into an elegant coiffure. She wore deep burgundy that would have been scandalous on someone less assured, and her bearing suggested someone who'd never questioned her right to command any space she entered. "Miss Gregory," the woman said, her voice rich with cultured authority. "I'm Lady Freya Ashton, the Duke's aunt. Lucas asked me to attend you while he deals with the rather spectacular mess your stepmother has created." "Lady Freya," Harriet started to rise, but Freya waved her back down. "None of that. You've had quite enough performance for one day." She settled into the opposite chair with casual grace, studying Harriet with eyes the same storm grey as her nephew's. "Let me see your face." Harriet turned her cheek obediently. The skin still felt hot, the outline of Brooke's fingers lightly visible. "She has a strong arm, your stepmother," Freya observed dispassionately, "and a weak mind. Only a fool strikes in public what she's been abusing in private." The blunt assessment made Harriet's breath catch. "You know?" "My dear girl, everyone with eyes knows something's been wrong at Gregory House since your father died. The question was whether anyone with power would care enough to intervene." Freya's expression softened slightly. "Lucas cared. Thomas Gregory saved his life once, during a parliamentary session where certain lords had rather violent objections to reform proposals. Your father stepped between Lucas and a very angry man with a very sharp letter-opener." Harriet hadn't known that. Her father had never mentioned it. "So you see," my nephew continued, "he takes his debts seriously. And beyond that, he despises bullies. Always has. Watching that woman strike you in his own gardens?" She smiled, sharp as a blade. "She might as well have declared war on Castle itself." "What happens now?" Harriet asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. Now we prepare for battle." Freya leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Your stepmother will not surrender easily. She has your father's will, guardianship rights, and likely a physician ready to declare you unfit if pressed. She'll use every weapon at her disposal." "I know." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Dr. Thornbury, the asylum, she's threatened it before." "Of course she has. It's the classic tactic. Make the victim believe they're powerless, that resistance will only prove their instability." Freya's voice hardened. "But here's what that woman doesn't understand. Victimhood is not the same as powerlessness, and silence is not the same as weakness." Harriet looked up, something stirring in her chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you have been surviving, Miss Gregory, enduring, protecting yourself in the only way available to you, by appearing compliant while maintaining your sanity and your truth." Freya arose, pacing to the window. "That takes remarkable strength,
But survival is no longer enough. Now we transform that strength into authority. How? The question felt desperate. She controls everything, the estate, the finances, even my correspondence. She controls the mechanisms. She does not control the truth. And truth, properly wielded before the right audience, is the most powerful weapon of all. She turned back, her expression fierce. Tell me, does your stepmother keep records, ledgers, evidence of how she's been managing the estate? Yes, father's old study. She's taken it over. And these sales she's making, the northern acreage you mentioned, are there others? Harriet nodded slowly. The timber rights, some of mother's jewelry. Father's library was sold last month to a collector. Brooke claimed it was necessary for maintaining the household, but the amounts never appeared in the estate accounts I was allowed to see. Because they went into her personal accounts. Your stepmother is embezzling, Miss Gregory, systematically stealing from an estate she's meant to safeguard. That's not guardianship, that's theft. The word landed like a key turning in a lock. Theft, not management, not difficult decisions, theft. But proving it will require access to those records, yes, which Lucas is arranging as we speak. But beyond evidence, we need something more important. We need you to stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like the rightful heir to the Gregory estate. I don't understand. You will. Freya's gaze was steady, challenging. When you walk into a room, do you apologize for taking up space? Harriet thought of breakfast tables, of constant corrections, of making herself small and quiet and invisible. Yes. Stop. When someone questions your judgment, do you defer immediately? Yes. Stop. When you're angry, do you swallow it down and smile? Harriet's throat tightened. Yes. Stop. Freya leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost fierce. Your stepmother has spent 6 months training you to doubt yourself, to question your own perceptions, to believe that your thoughts and feelings are evidence of instability rather than reason. That ends today. Do you understand me? I don't know how. You learn, starting now. Freya stood, extending her hand. Come, Lucas will want to speak with you about the magistrate's visit. Sir Scott Ellis will likely call tomorrow or the next day to assess your welfare. We need you ready. Harriet took the offered hand and arose, her legs unsteady. And Miss Gregory, Freya's grip tightened, strong and sure. When Sir Scott asks you questions, you will answer with clarity and confidence. You will not apologize. You will not defer. You will speak truth with the authority of someone who knows her own mind, because that woman has been lying about you, and we're going to prove it.
Sir Scott Ellis arrived at Bewcastle Manor on Saturday afternoon in a carriage bearing the county seal, his expression already set in the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to unpleasant duties. Harriet watched from the drawing-room window as Lucas greeted him on the drive, the two men conferring briefly before turning toward the house. "Remember," Lady Freya said quietly from her position by the fireplace, "you are not on trial. He is here to assess facts, not to judge your character based on your stepmother's fantasies." "He looks as though he's already made up his mind," Harriet said, noting the magistrate's stern bearing. "Then we change it." Freya moved beside her. "Posture, Miss Gregory. You're the daughter of Thomas Gregory, not a criminal awaiting sentence." Harriet straightened, her hands clasped loosely at her waist rather than twisted together. Every gesture Brooke had trained into her, the apologetic hunch, the downcast eyes, the nervous fidgeting, had to be consciously corrected. The door opened. Lucas entered first, followed by Sir Scott Ellis. The magistrate was perhaps 60, with iron-grey hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades enforcing law. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Harriet with an assessment that made her skin prickle. "Sir Scott," Lucas said formally, "may I present Miss Harriet Gregory? Miss Gregory, Sir Scott Ellis, magistrate for the county."
"Sir Scott," Harriet curtsied, keeping the gesture brief and dignified. "Thank you for taking the time to visit. Miss Gregory," his tone was coolly professional, "I trust you understand the reason for my call. I understand that my stepmother has made certain claims about my mental state, claims I'm prepared to address directly." Surprise flickered in Sir Scott's expression. He'd expected nervousness, fragility, the very symptoms Brooke had described. "Lady Brooke has expressed significant concern," Sir Scott said, settling into the chair Lucas indicated. "She reports episodes of confusion, melancholy, and what she terms inappropriate fixations on estate matters beyond your understanding." Inappropriate fixations. Harriet recognized Brooke's poison in the words. "Might I ask what specifically she considers inappropriate? My concern for tenant families my father personally promised to protect, my questions for expenditures that appear nowhere in the estate accounts, or simply my refusal to accept every decision without question." Sir Scott's eyebrows rose. "You seem quite articulate for someone reported to suffer from confusion." "I'm not confused, Sir Scott. My stepmother has spent 6 months undermining my confidence, questioning my perceptions, and threatening institutionalization whenever I object to her management of my inheritance." "Strong accusations," Sir Scott observed. "Lady Brooke presents as a concerned guardian dealing with a difficult ward." "Lady Brooke presents beautifully," Harriet agreed. "She's had years of practice, but presentation and truth are not the same thing." Lucas, standing by the window, made a small sound that might have been approval. "The incident at the picnic," Sir Scott continued, consulting his notes. "Lady Brooke claims you became hysterical, making wild accusations about estate sales, that the altercation was regrettable but provoked by your distress." "I stated a fact," Harriet said, her voice hardening. "The northern acreage is being sold against my father's explicit wishes. When I mentioned it to the Duke, my stepmother struck me across the face in front of 40 witnesses. You may verify this with any guest who attended." "The Duke has already provided testimony," Sir Scott said, glancing at Lucas, "as has Lady Pemberton and several others. The physical violence is not in dispute." "Then what is?" Harriet leaned forward slightly. "If you accept that she struck me for speaking truth, why would you credit her claims about my mental state?" "Because violence can be provoked by genuinely disturbed behavior, or it can be the act of someone whose control is slipping." Harriet kept her gaze steady. "My stepmother has spent 6 months undermining my confidence, questioning my perceptions, and threatening institutionalization whenever I object to her management of my inheritance." "Strong accusations," Sir Scott observed. "Lady Brooke presents as a concerned guardian dealing with a difficult ward." "Lady Brooke presents beautifully," Harriet agreed. "She's had years of practice, but presentation and truth are not the same thing." Lucas, standing by the window, made a small sound that might have been approval. "The incident at the picnic," Sir Scott continued, consulting his notes. "Lady Brooke claims you became hysterical, making wild accusations about estate sales, that the altercation was regrettable but provoked by your distress." "I stated a fact," Harriet said, her voice hardening. "The northern acreage is being sold against my father's explicit wishes. When I mentioned it to the Duke, my stepmother struck me across the face in front of 40 witnesses. You may verify this with any guest who attended." "The Duke has already provided testimony," Sir Scott said, glancing at Lucas, "as has Lady Pemberton and several others. The physical violence is not in dispute." "Then what is?" Harriet leaned forward slightly. "If you accept that she struck me for speaking truth, why would you credit her claims about my mental state?" "Because violence can be provoked by genuinely disturbed behavior, or it can be the act of someone whose control is slipping." Harriet kept her gaze steady. My stepmother has been managing my father's estate for 6 months. In that time, she's dismissed his solicitor of 20 years, sold ancestral land and family heirlooms, and systematically isolated me from anyone who might question her authority. These are not the actions of a concerned guardian, they're the actions of someone embezzling." The word hung in the air like a pistol shot. Sir Scott's expression shifted to sharp attention. "You're accusing your stepmother of theft." "I'm stating what the evidence will show once properly examined." Harriet's hands remained steady in her lap. "Mr. Blackwell, my father's former solicitor, had questions about estate transactions before he was dismissed. I suggest you speak with him and examine the household accounts. The discrepancies will speak for themselves." Sir Scott was quiet for a long moment, studying her with renewed interest. "You seem remarkably composed for someone your stepmother describes as emotionally fragile." "Perhaps that's because her description is designed to discredit anything I might say against her." Harriet met his gaze without flinching. "Tell me, Sir Scott, if you wanted to institutionalize someone to maintain control of their inheritance, wouldn't the first step be establishing a reputation for instability?" "That's quite a calculated accusation." "It's a calculated strategy," Harriet corrected, "and it nearly worked. If she hadn't lost her temper at the picnic, she might have succeeded in having me declared unfit with no one questioning the narrative." Lucas stepped forward, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Sir Scott, I knew Thomas Gregory for a decade. He was one of the finest minds on estate management I've ever encountered. Does the woman before you strike you as confused or hysterical?" Sir Scott looked from Lucas to Harriet, then to Lady Freya's fierce presence. Finally, he closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "No," he said slowly, "she does not, but I will need to examine those financial records." "They will be made available," Lucas said. Sir Scott rose, and Harriet rose with him, her posture straight. She'd done it. She'd faced the magistrate and hadn't broken. "Miss Gregory," Sir Scott said, his tone considerably warmer, "I believe we'll speak again soon, under rather different circumstances." After he'd departed, Harriet's legs suddenly felt weak. She sank back into her chair. "Well done," Lady Freya said, satisfaction rich in her voice. "You didn't apologize once."
The study at Gregory House felt like a tomb when Harriet entered it 3 days later, flanked by Lucas and Mr. Blackwell. The solicitor had produced a court order granting them access to the estate records, and Brooke's new man, Mr. Pike, had no choice but to admit them, though his displeasure was written in every rigid line of his posture. Brooke herself was conspicuously absent, having retreated to her rooms with a claimed headache the moment Lucas's carriage appeared on the drive. "Coward," Lady Freya had said with satisfaction when they'd heard. She'd remained at Bewcastle Manor, declaring that too many bodies would only slow the investigation. Now Harriet stood in the doorway of her father's sanctuary, seeing it through new eyes. Brooke had redecorated, of course, the warm burgundy curtains replaced with cold grey silk, the comfortable leather chair swapped for something more fashionable and less inviting. But the bones remained. The mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, though notably depleted. The morning light still fell across the same worn patch of carpet. "Miss Gregory," Mr. Blackwell's voice was gentle. He'd aged since she'd last seen him, new lines carved around his eyes, but his gaze remained sharp. "Where would your father have kept the primary ledgers?" "The locked drawer," Harriet said. "Bottom right. He kept the key on his watch chain, but Brooke must have found it," Lucas finished, producing a small brass key from his pocket. "Among her things, Sir Scott's warrant was quite thorough." The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside lay 3 leather-bound ledgers, their spines labelled in her father's precise script. Estate accounts 1823 to 1824, 1824 to 1825, 1826 to 1826. The last entry would have been made just before his death. Mr. Blackwell lifted them carefully, settling at the desk to begin his examination. Lucas moved to the bookshelves, scanning titles with practiced efficiency. "What are you looking for?" Harriet asked.
Discrepancies, he said. Your stepmother is clever, but embezzlers always make mistakes. They can't help themselves. The lies compound. The numbers stop adding up. Harriet wandered to the window, her father's ring heavy on her finger. This room had been her education, her refuge, a connection to a man who'd believed she was capable of so much more than society dictated. Now it felt violated, Brooke's presence lingering like smoke even in her absence. Miss Gregory, Mr. Blackwell's voice held a note of grim satisfaction. You'll want to see this. She moved to stand behind him, looking over his shoulder at the neat columns of figures. What am I looking at? The Northern Acreage Sale. Your father's ledger shows the land valued at approximately £4,000, based on comparable sales and tenant contracts. Lady Brooke's records show the sale for £2,800. A difference of £1,200, Lucas said, joining them. Where did it go? Into her personal accounts, I'd wager, Mr. Blackwell said. He continued flipping pages, his finger tracing lines of text. Here, your mother's emerald necklace, your father's valuation £600, Lady Brooke's recorded sale £300, the Wedgwood service £200 actual value, sold for £75 according to these records. The pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Every sale, every transaction, skimmed and doctored, thousands of pounds diverted from the estate into Brooke's control. How much total? Harriet asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Blackwell's expression was grim. Based on what I'm seeing here, at least £8,000 over 6 months, possibly more if there are transactions not recorded in these ledgers. £8,000, a fortune, her inheritance systematically stolen while Brooke played the concerned guardian.
It's enough, Lucas said quietly, more than enough to prove fraud and remove her guardianship. But Harriet was staring at the bookshelves, something nagging at her consciousness. The depleted shelves, her father's library, sold last month according to Brooke. Except his journals, she said suddenly. Where are his journals? Both men looked at her. Journals? Mr. Blackwell asked. Father kept personal journals, not just accounts, but observations, correspondence summaries, notes on meetings and decisions. She moved to the shelves, running her fingers along the spines. He used to let me read them sometimes. He said they were his way of thinking through problems. Would Lady Brooke have sold them? Lucas asked. No. Harriet's certainty grew. She wouldn't have understood their value. They weren't valuable books, just his personal musings. She would have... Her hand stopped on a gap in the shelf, a space where 3 volumes should have been. She knelt, peering into the shadow behind the remaining books, and her fingers found leather. Here, she breathed, pulling out 3 slim journals, their covers worn from handling. Her father's familiar handwriting marked each spine with dates, 1824, 1825, 1826. She opened the most recent one, dated January 1826, the month before her father's death. The entries were brief, fragments of thought and observation, but one passage made her heart stop. Brooke grows impatient. She believes my affection for her grants her authority over my affairs. I have corrected this misapprehension, but I fear she does not accept it. Must instruct Blackwell to ensure the will's provisions are ironclad, though his absence today troubles me. The fever worsens. Must ensure Harriet understands the truth is in the details, always in the details. The truth is in the details, Harriet whispered, turning pages with trembling fingers. He knew what she was. Further back, another entry. Reviewed accounts with Blackwell. All estate assets catalogued and valued. Copy secured in the usual place. Should anything happen to me, Harriet must know the emerald necklace is worth 600, the northern acreage 4,000 minimum. These figures are not negotiable. The usual place, Lucas said, reading over her shoulder. Where would that be? Harriet thought of afternoons in this study, her father teaching her about estate management, his habits, his methods, his...
"The globe," she said, moving to the large terrestrial globe that stood in the corner. She twisted the brass meridian, and the top hemisphere lifted, revealing the hollow interior. Inside lay a single document, folded and sealed with her father's crest. Mr. Blackwell broke the seal with careful fingers and unfolded what proved to be a complete inventory of the estate, dated and signed by both Thomas Gregory and Blackwell himself. "It's all here," the solicitor said, wonder in his voice. "Every asset, every valuation, every contract, a perfect record of what the estate should contain." "He left me a weapon," Harriet said, her throat tight. "He left me the truth, Miss Gregory, and the truth is about to set you free." The morning of the hearing arrived with an unseasonable chill. Harriet stood before the long mirror in her guest chamber at Bewcastle, adjusting the collar of her dove-grey gown. Lady Freya had chosen it deliberately, sombre enough to convey seriousness, elegant enough to remind anyone present that Harriet Gregory was a woman of breeding, not a patient requiring restraint. "Hold still," Lady Freya murmured, fastening a simple strand of pearls at Harriet's throat. "These were your mother's. Lucas found them among the items Brooke had misplaced." Harriet's fingers rose to touch the pearls, cool and smooth against the skin. Another piece of her inheritance, quietly returned. "She'll fight viciously today," Lady Freya continued, stepping back to assess her work. "Cornered animals always do, but you have something she does not." "What is that?" "The truth, and witnesses willing to speak it." Lady Freya's eyes glinted. "Sir Scott has reviewed the ledgers. He arrived an hour ago and has been closeted with Lucas ever since." Harriet's stomach tightened. The ledgers, her father's meticulous records, cross-referenced with bank statements Lucas had obtained through channels she dared not question. The evidence was damning: systematic embezzlement, forged signatures, accounts drained and redirected. Brooke had been stealing from the Gregory estate for nearly 2 years. But evidence alone would not be enough. Harriet understood that now. In this world, a woman's word was weighed against her reputation, her composure, her ability to perform sanity and stability before men who held her fate in their hands. She would have to be perfect. The hearing was held in the great library at Bewcastle, a tactical choice. Sir Scott Ellis had agreed to conduct the inquiry privately, away from the public scrutiny of a formal courtroom, but that privacy came with conditions. He would listen, he would examine, and he would render judgment based not on emotion, but on law. Harriet entered the room with Lady Freya at her side. The chamber was austere in its grandeur, floor-to-ceiling shelves with leather-bound volumes, a massive oak table at the center, and 3 tall windows that let in the pale morning light. Lucas stood near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Sir Scott sat at the head of the table, spectacles perched on his narrow nose, papers spread before him. And there, across the table, sat Lady Brooke McCarthy. Brooke had dressed in deep mourning black, a veil drawn back just enough to reveal her face, pale, composed, the very picture of a grieving widow burdened by a disturbed stepdaughter. Her gloved hands rested demurely in her lap. When her eyes met Harriet's, there was no warmth, no recognition, only cold assessment. "Lady Harriet," Sir Scott said, gesturing to the chair opposite Brooke, "please be seated." Harriet moved forward, every step measured. She would not tremble, she would not falter. Lady Freya took the chair beside her. Lucas remained standing, a silent sentinel by the fire. Sir Scott cleared his throat. "This inquiry has been convened to address the petition filed by Lady Brooke McCarthy, guardian to Lady Harriet Gregory, requesting an evaluation of Lady Harriet's mental competency and fitness to manage her own affairs." He paused, glancing over his spectacles. "Given the seriousness of these claims, I have reviewed documentation provided by both parties. We will proceed with testimony." "Thank you, Sir Scott," Lady Brooke said, her voice soft, pained. I take no pleasure in this, but I fear for dear Harriet's safety and for the family name. Your concerns are noted, Lady Brooke. However, I will hear from Lady Harriet first. Brooke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sir Scott turned to Harriet. Lady Harriet, you have been accused of erratic behavior, refusal to comply with your lawful authority, and a tendency toward melancholia and hysteria. How do you respond? Harriet met his gaze directly. I respond, Sir Scott, that I have been isolated, controlled, and systematically stripped of my inheritance by the woman who now sits across from me. What Lady Brooke calls erratic behavior is my resistance to her theft. What she calls hysteria is my refusal to be silent. Lady Brooke's hand fluttered to her throat. See, she is delusional. She invents conspiracies. Lady Brooke, Sir Scott said sharply, you will have your turn. Silence fell.
Sir Scott leaned back in his chair. Lady Harriet, these are serious accusations. Do you have evidence? I do. Lucas moved then, stepping forward to place a leather portfolio on the table before Sir Scott. The late Lord Gregory's personal ledgers, Lucas said quietly, cross-referenced with bank records obtained from Coutts & Co. You will find discrepancies amounting to over £12,000, withdrawn by Lady Brooke under false pretenses and diverted to accounts held in her name alone. Sir Scott opened the portfolio, his expression sharpening as he scanned the pages. Minutes passed in tense silence. Brooke's breathing grew audible, quick and shallow. Lady Brooke, Sir Scott said at last, his tone glacial, can you explain these withdrawals? Household expenses, Brooke said quickly. The estate is expensive to maintain. Harriet has no understanding of— The estate has been sold, Harriet said steadily, to a Mr. Whitmore for £11,000, a sale arranged without my knowledge or consent, despite my being of legal age and the rightful heir. Brooke's face flushed. You were in no condition to make such decisions. The doctors said— What doctors? Lady Freya interjected coolly. I have found no medical records, no signed evaluations, only your word, Lady Brooke, which grows less credible by the moment. I acted in her best interest. Brooke's voice rose, control slipping. She is weak, fragile, she cannot manage. She is sitting across from you, Harriet said, each word deliberate, presenting evidence and asking you to account for your actions. Does that sound like madness to you, Sir Scott? Sir Scott removed his spectacles, setting them carefully on the table. No, Lady Harriet, it does not. Brooke stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is a conspiracy. The Duke has influenced you, poisoned your mind against me. The Duke has done nothing but ensure the law is followed, and the law, Lady Brooke, is quite clear. You have misappropriated funds, you have sold property without proper authority, and you have attempted to deprive Lady Harriet of her rights through false claims of incompetence. She was hysterical. Brooke's composure shattered entirely. She defied me, humiliated me in front of society. You struck her, Lucas said, his voice low and cold, in front of witnesses, at my estate. The room seemed to shrink around those words. Brooke faltered, her face draining of color. She provoked me. By existing, Lady Freya's tone was scalpel sharp, by daring to inherit what was rightfully hers. Sir Scott stood. Lady Brooke McCarthy, I am hereby dissolving your guardianship over Lady Harriet Gregory, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am recommending a formal investigation into your financial conduct. You will make restitution of all misappropriated funds, and you will vacate any claim to the Gregory estate or properties. Brooke swayed, gripping the edge of the table. You cannot. I can, and I have. Sir Scott gathered his papers. Lady Harriet, you are free to manage your own affairs. I suggest you retain competent legal counsel to recover what has been taken from you. Harriet felt the words wash over her like light breaking through the clouds. Free. She was free.
Brooke turned to her, desperation twisting her features. "Harriet, please, I raised you. I cared for you." "You used me," Harriet said quietly, "and now you have nothing." Brooke opened her mouth, but no sound came. Then, gathering the tattered remnants of her dignity, she turned and walked from the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence she left behind. Sir Scott inclined his head to Harriet. "My apologies, Lady Harriet, for any delay in justice. Your father was a good man. He would be proud of you." "Thank you, Sir Scott." When the magistrate had gone, Lady Freya rose and squeezed Harriet's shoulder gently. "I'll leave you two alone," she murmured, and slipped out. Harriet remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of the moment settling over her like snow. She had won. She had spoken, and been heard and believed. The invisible chains had been broken. Lucas crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. "Are you all right?" Harriet looked at him, this man who had stopped a slap, who had offered sanctuary, who had helped her find her voice. "I am," she said. "For the first time in so long, I truly am." He smiled, a rare softening of his features. "Then what will you do now?" It was the question she had been asking herself since the moment Sir Scott had stood. Freedom was vast and terrifying and impossibly precious. She had her inheritance back, her name, her future, and she had a choice. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I want to find out." "Then find out. Take your time. The world will wait." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Will you?" His fingers tightened around hers. "As long as you need."
1 year later. The riverside at Bewcastle was exactly as Harriet remembered it. The same willows trailing their fingers in the current, the same sun-warmed grass stretching down to the water's edge, the same scent of summer roses drifting on the breeze. It was late June, and the estate had been opened for another picnic, smaller this time, more intimate. Lady Freya had insisted. Harriet stood at the edge of the lawn, watching the servants arrange tables beneath the shade of an ancient oak. White linen snapped in the wind, silver gleamed. It was almost identical to that day a year ago when everything had changed. But she was not the same woman who had stood here then. "Lady Harriet!" She turned at the sound of his voice. Lucas approached across the grass, dressed in dark grey, his expression as composed as ever. But there was something different in his eyes now, a warmth that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there, waiting for her to be ready to see it. "Your Grace," she said, a smile tugging at her lips, "you're very formal today." "Old habits." He stopped before her, hands clasped behind his back. "How was London?" "Exhausting, profitable, necessary." She had spent the past year in the city, working with solicitors to fully disentangle her estate from Brooke's damage, investing carefully, learning the mechanisms of her own wealth. She had attended lectures, cultivated friendships, and discovered that she had a mind for business her father would have admired. She had also discovered that she missed Bewcastle, missed the quiet strength of this place, missed him. "I received your letters, all of them." "And you replied to each one?" "I did." They had written constantly over the months, long, thoughtful letters that spoke of books and politics, of estate management and the absurdities of London society. Letters that said everything except the one thing they both knew but had not yet spoken aloud. "I heard you refused 3 proposals," Lucas said, a hint of amusement in his voice. 4, actually. Lord Pemberton was very persistent." "Should I be jealous?" "Not remotely." Harriet stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "None of them saw me, Lucas. They saw my inheritance, my name, my father's legacy, but not me. And what do I see?" She looked up at him, this man who had given her space to grow, who had never demanded or assumed, who had simply waited. "I think you see exactly who I am, and I think you always have."
His hand rose, hesitating just shy of her cheek. "May I?" Such a small question, such enormous respect contained within it. "Yes." His fingers brushed her face, gentle and sure. "I have waited a year to ask you something, Harriet, but I need you to understand that if your answer is no, it changes nothing between us. You will always have my friendship, my support, my—" "Lucas," she caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. "Ask me."
He drew a slow breath. "Will you marry me? Not because I rescued you, not because society expects it, not because you owe me anything, but because you choose it, because you choose me." The simplicity of it nearly undid her. No grand declaration, no performance of romance, just honesty, offered like a gift. "I spent this year learning who I am," Harriet said softly, "learning what I want, what I'm capable of, what I will and will not accept from this world, and every discovery led me back to the same truth." She stepped into him, her free hand rising to rest over his heart. "I choose you, Lucas Chapman, not as my savior, as my equal, as my partner, as the man I love." The transformation in his face was subtle but complete. Relief, joy, something deeper than either, it swept through him like dawn breaking over the horizon. "Harriet," her name was a prayer on his lips. He kissed her then, there on the riverside where everything had begun. It was not the desperate kiss of rescue or the tentative brush of first affection. It was the kiss of two people who had found each other in the wreckage of injustice and built something new from the ruins. Equal, chosen, free. When they finally drew apart, Harriet laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated happiness. "What?" Lucas asked, smiling down at her. "I was just thinking about that picnic, the slap, the whisper. I was so certain my life was ending. And now?" She looked around at the estate, the river, the summer sky stretching endlessly above them, then back at him. "Now I think it's finally beginning." Lady Freya's voice carried across the lawn. "If you two are quite finished being sentimental, luncheon is served." Harriet grinned. "She's going to be insufferable, you realize. She'll claim full credit for this." "She'll be correct," Lucas said, tucking Harriet's hand into the crook of his arm. "But I find I don't mind." They walked together toward the picnic, toward Lady Freya's knowing smile, toward a future built not on obligation or control, but on trust, respect, and deliberate mutual choice. Harriet glanced down at her left hand, where her father's signet ring still rested, no longer the only piece of her legacy she possessed, but a reminder of how far she had come, how much she had reclaimed. And as they reached the table, as Lucas pulled her chair with old-fashioned courtesy, and Lady Freya raised her glass in an exaggerated toast, Harriet felt something she had not felt in years. Peace. Not the peace of silence or submission, the peace of a woman who knew her own mind, her own worth, her own power, who had faced her demons and emerged victorious, who had been offered rescue but had chosen partnership instead. The peace of someone finally, fully free. The afternoon unfolded in easy conversation and quiet laughter. The river continued its ancient flow, indifferent to human drama. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent toward evening, and on the lawn at Bewcastle, beneath the oak tree where injustice had once reigned, love, patient, chosen, equal, took root and grew. Harriet Gregory had come to this place broken and afraid, believing herself weak. She left it whole, beloved, and certain of her own strength. And that, she thought, as Lucas's fingers laced through hers beneath the table, was the greatest victory of all.